Okay, it should be streaming on Facebook now.
Okay, good.
Now we've just got to keep an eye out for our guest.
Yes. I'll give her a call.
Yes, we are on Facebook, David.
Yep.
That's good.
Hey, how you going? Okay, I'm looking for you. Are you guys in the room, or have you signed on?
Yep, we're just getting now.
Okie dokie.
Just one sec.
Okay, shouldn't be long. Maybe you should sing or something, Alan, while we're waiting.
No, that was never a plan. I quite liked playing a bit of music while we were waiting for everybody. I don't know whether...
I haven't got that set up, but...
Only if it's Smokey Robinson and the Miracles.
Okay, we're gathering good numbers now.
There she is.
Oh, there she is. Good.
The woman of the hour.
Okay.
How do we move her to the top of the first page?
No, she'll move to the top.
You can say hello, Kimberley.
Hello, how are you?
Now you've got some interesting background there. Which city?
That's Melbourne. That's Melbourne at dusk. So I'm in my elected office, and that's the background for sort of the studio, for the cameras for television. So they use it as a background. That's good.
Does look good.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll get to see it soon because it's more than 5 kilometres away.
So that's the southern ghost town at the moment.
Oh, I feel very sad about it. Anyway.
Yeah, well,
Alan, I think we're on time pretty well. So
yep, we should make a start. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm again your MC for the evening, and I am the Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, and Ted Lapkin, our Executive Director. So good evening to you as well as to our special guest for tonight, Senator Kimberley Kitching, who we will introduce in a moment. Now, tonight, Ted will be the one speaking with the Senator for about 30 minutes, after which we will open up the discussion with a live Q&A session from the audience. Now, on that point, I just want to mention that in the past, I have asked people to click on the reactions icon to register their interest in asking a question, but I've since discovered that this is not the same as electronically raising a hand. What actually happens with the reaction is that a little clap or a thumbs up goes up into the corner of my screen for about 1 second and then appears, so I don't actually notice who's done that. So the best way to get our attention for a question is to click on the participants icon and then click on the raise hand icon along the bottom. Now, if you don't see this, then it's because you've turned off this function, but clicking on the green tick will also catch our attention. The chat function is available for general comments as usual, so feel free to send messages to the audience during the discussion. And for those of you who are not sure how to use this, clicking on the chat icon in the middle of the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen will open up the chat window. Now, everybody has been muted to prevent all those annoying noises during the first part of the session, but we will allow people to unmute themselves for the question time. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Ted, who will introduce our guest and get the session rolling. Over to you, Ted.
Thank you. Welcome to another AJA webinar. We've done so many of these now that they've become a little bit of an institution. So I think it's about time we conjured up a pithy event title to describe what's going on here. May I suggest Pilpule pestilence, from the Hebrew term for close textual study of Talmud, or maybe contagion cogitation. In any event, to the matter at hand. Welcome, Senator Kimberley Kitching. I first met Kimberley through the good offices of her husband, Andrew. Andrew was famous, and in the eyes of some, infamous, for the bare knuckles political journalism he practiced through his blog site, Vex News. He had more of his fair share of scandalous scoops. And at the height of in light of the vexation it generated within the highest portals of power, Vex News was very aptly named. But Andrew is also a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist, to the point where, by comparison, he sometimes makes me look like a hippie flower child. Needless to say, Andrew and I hit it off famously, and when he introduced me to Kimberley, the bromance went to the next level, or perhaps I should say quadromance, because Andrew and Kimberley became fast friends with my wife Sharon as well, all long before she became a senator. Kimberley was born in Brisbane, where her father taught chemistry as UQ. One of her closest friends growing up was Chloe Shorten, while Andrew has been close mates with Bill Shorten since their days at Melbourne Uni. I think it's fair to say that those ties have proved useful over time. As a child, Kimberley spent considerable time in Europe and the US, where her father had visiting professorships. She matriculated at UQ, where she studied arts law and joined Young Labour, becoming a member of the Right faction. After graduation, she practiced law in Brisbane for a few years until moving to Melbourne. She was a Melbourne City Councillor and worked in a variety of senior legal and political roles before winning pre-selection to win the casual vacancy created by the retirement of Senator Stephen Conroy, another good friend of our community. Since entering the Senate in 2016, Kimberley has taken a particular interest in defense and foreign affairs. She's a strong supporter of the Australia-US alliance and a passionate Zionist. She just loves putting on her camis and body armor while visiting the troops in Afghanistan. She was a founding member of the Wolverines, an informal group of parliamentarians who joined together to decry China's human rights abuses and to counter Beijing's foreign policy belligerence. Andrew Hastie, who is our first contagion cogitation guest, is another Wolverine. And by all accounts, Xi Jinping is not a happy camper, to the point where Andrew Hastie and Victorian Senator James Patterson, another Wolverine, had their China study tour canceled last November. So Kimba, if you have any more of those Wolverine claw stickers left, I want one for my computer.
Well,
one of the more disquieting things I discovered during my years as a political staffer is how intellectually pedestrian the Australian Parliament can be. In fact, in some quarters, one might say that there's an active anti-intellectual bias at work. But Kimberley is cut from a different bolt of cerebral claw. I've been accused in my day of being a bit of a nerd. So imagine my delight when I discovered a kindred spirit in Kimberley. She is multilingual and historically literate, the sort of person to whom you can throw un bon mot en français and she'll respond in kind. When you make an oblique reference to the Westphalian order, she knows exactly what you mean, the concept of modern nationalism arising from the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War. In other words, regardless of our differing political tribal affiliations on the issues that really matter, Kimberley Kitching is my kind of politician. So welcome, Kimberley.
Shalom, Toda. Thank you. It's fantastic to be here. And Ted is very generous, but we do have some more Wolverine stickers. And in fact, I was just on a group text conversation with Andrew Hastie, James Patterson and Tim Wilson, partly about, Tim and I were on Q&A together on Monday evening. So we were sort of Andrew and James were teasing us about that, really, but we do have some stickers, so I'll get you one, Ted.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So let's start with an easy one. You've been one of the most prominent voices. Well, easy. I mean, ideologically, it may be a little more difficult legislatively. You've been one of the most prominent voices in the Australian Parliament calling for the adoption of so-called Magnitsky legislation. Can you tell us who Sergei Magnitsky was and what this type of legislation is designed to achieve?
So Sergei Magnitsky was a tax advisor at a law firm in Moscow, and he was hired by Bill Browder. And Bill Browder founded Hermitage Capital, and it was a hedge fund. But he knew something wasn't right with the books. So he employed Sergei Magnitsky to look at the Russian operation to see what was wrong, why, the accounts weren't adding up. Anyway, Sergei Magnitsky uncovered about 200 million, 300 million US in embezzled funds. They'd been embezzled by essentially the police force in Moscow, or the senior people there. Anyway, he was arrested by the police force and put in jail without charge, and he was essentially tortured to death in jail. And Bill Browder was so outraged and so upset that he took it upon himself to start saying, well, if these officials do this, then they should not be able to travel to the United States, and they shouldn't be able to own property there. That property, if they own property there, which they've obviously gained through ill-gotten means, then that property should be seized by the United States. So at first it was, so he was successful in passing that, and John McCain, the former presidential candidate who died recently, he was one of the movers of this legislation, and it was a bipartisan. It was supported in a bipartisan way. In the first flush, it was only legislation that applied to Russian citizens. Since then, the US has passed what's called the Global Magnitsky Act, and so it applies around the world. So if you have committed gross acts of human rights violations, if you have embezzled large sums of money, you will not be able to travel. You can be refused a visa, property you own there, or property that can be traced back to you. So their Department of Treasury is also involved in this. That property will be seized by the state.
So if the British did something like that, there would be a lot of posh houses in Kensington that would be seized by the government.
And maybe some football teams. But
that's right.
So the UK has passed that type of legislation, as has Canada, and Australia. So what happened was Bill Browder was on the 7:30 report, and Michael Danby and I saw it, and Michael had a private member's bill. He was obviously retired since then. I have a private senator's bill, but when we didn't win government last year, there have been general discussions, and this is why I'm always interested in talking to lots of people in Parliament House. And I had been discussing this with Andrew Hastie, for example, with James Paterson. And eventually that led to the Foreign Minister being interested. So she's obviously also in the Senate, Marise Payne.
So Marise is on board?
So Marise then wrote a reference to the Joint Standing Committee for Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, and I'm a member of that. And that committee has just finished doing hearings, and it's doing a draft report now. Now, what I will tell you, which might be a little bit of a surprise, because this isn't the normal way, but we are drafting our own legislation because the committee members feel that we've been there, we've heard all of the evidence. Jeffrey Robertson gave evidence, and he very kindly offered pro bono to write the prologue for the legislation. I think it will be supported in a bipartisan way, and we will have Magnitsky legislation. And one of my favorite sayings from Ronald Reagan, and my husband and I have both been to the Ronald Reagan Library, and that we have a mug at home which says, "There is no limit to what a man can achieve if he doesn't mind who gets the credit." So I don't mind who gets the credit for this legislation. I don't mind, that it will obviously be legislation that's moved by the government, because I actually think we need Magnitsky legislation. So we have here in Melbourne, and this was the subject of a Four Corners program, members of the Cambodian community who are related to generals who have, they've bought property in Australia, and those generals have essentially embezzled or stood over people in Cambodia, and have then used that to, buy property in what's really essentially a safe haven for them. So what I find offensive is someone who's committed immoral acts, using our system and our excellent rule of law and our really safe property title system for their own purposes, for a purpose we would never countenance in this country.
Well, very well done, and it's as I say in Hebrew, Avodat Kodesh. It's holy work.
Thank you.
Now, I wanted to ask you about move on to the issue of kind of the left in general and the ALP in 2020. For a number of years, it'll take me a minute or so to set up the question, but and you and I have spoken about this at dinner actually, but for a number of years, I've been of the view that we're living through the death throes of the welfare state as it emerged in the wake of World War II, because it's physically unsustainable. And the discontinuity between the cargo cult expectations of people and the limited capacities of government have deepened, and the social pain that's been inflicted on wide swaths of population has worsened. We're going through a process of transition, and that has inflicted serious social pain on a wide swath. Economic stagnation, endemic unemployment, ethnic discord. You see this in stark relief throughout continental Western Europe. And all of these have generated what I call an electoral centrifugal effect, in which dissatisfaction with the established order has driven voters from the political center to the populist extremes at either end of the spectrum. Now, we've escaped the worst of this, thankfully, in Australia so far, but you see in France, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest, the AFD in Germany, Brexit, and the schism between the conservative countries of Eastern Europe and the kind of progressive establishment in the West. And on the left, we see Labour being torn asunder by momentum and the Corbynite movement, and the Democrats being dragged towards radicalism by the Bernie Bros / AOC wing of the party. And this is a source of concern for us, because there's a real problem of anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Zionism on the left. And just this past week, two very notorious Democrats, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, cruised to victory in their primary elections that virtually guarantee their return to the US Congress for another term. Now, bear in mind that I'm a conservative when I say this, so feel free to set me straight if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that there's a cohort within the ALP that's indistinguishable from the Greens in philosophy and policy outlook. The only difference is that these leftists want access to real political power rather than howling at the moon as a perpetual protest party, and that's why they're in the ALP, trying to drag it to the left, like AOC with the Democrats, instead of rubbing shoulders with Adam Bandt. So can you give us a look into the inner dynamics of the Australian Labor Party? And I mean, is it realistic for us to worry that the ALP might undergo a process of Corbynization over the coming years?
I don't think so. The reason I say that is, in some ways, we in the Australian Labor Party have been very lucky that those elements have chosen to go to the Greens. And essentially, and I said this in an article in the Australian, and it was, I think it's fair to say, reasonably controversial internally. But I said that, you know, the Greens had enabled the Labor Party in Australia to build a Corbyn-proof fence. And by that I mean that those elements have gone over to the Greens. So they're not within the Labor Party. You know, there may be touches of them, not in the, I would say, not in the elected representatives, so in the caucus. There are obviously in some branches you'll come across people. In fact, in Queensland, there's an office holder of the Queensland branch who is incredibly pro-Palestinian, and her name is Wendy Turner. But I think that they're really quite few and far between, because mostly, you know, the ALP, look, it is a broad church, much like the Liberal, you know, people say about the Liberal Party, but it also is moderate in a lot of regards. Whether, you know, look, I guess at the moment you've got a federal Liberal government that's quite Keynesian in its economic approach. So I mean, in some ways, in terms of economics, you're looking at a real mix simply because of what's happened with the pandemic and the fact that government had to put out, well, a lot of money in order to support people. But what I would say to you is that, you know, my view on that is that not yet, because obviously we haven't sort of worked our way through the virus to an extent where you can have a certain amount of suppression of it. But eventually you cannot have half a workforce approximately on government money. You need to encourage enterprise, and you need to, you know, set the parameters, set the signals for business to work, because who employs people, who creates jobs? And really it's that, you know, jobs are in the DNA of the Labor Party. It's in its very name, in fact. Those jobs are created by business. And I look at some of the, you know, companies in Melbourne. So I look at Visy, which started with, you know, a very small number of people, Richard Pratt, and very small number of people. And now it employs tens of thousands of people in multiple countries. You look at Myers Emporium, as it was, with one store, it now, you know, employs thousands of people. So that's what those, and it's not just those large businesses, it's also, I mean, I think about people who might have started a small business, or they're a sole trader. They've started that, in fact, by government diktat. They haven't really been able to open their doors in the last little while. But so to have that confidence to do that again, that's what I think government needs to concentrate on, whether you're in government, in the executive, or certainly I think to encourage and send those signals, even if you're in the opposition, because I think the view that you can't do anything from opposition is not true. And I've just given you an example of, you know, Magnitsky, where it is, you are able to do things. So it's about framing the debate. To go back to your original point about, you know, are we going to have AOC, for example, or
somebody like Linda Singh, for example, the Tasmanian Center, or Melissa Park, for example. Linda Singh, Melissa Park. You have that element within the outfit, and you see it at the national conferences.
We do, but usually what happens is those people get, and I think this is the appropriate verb, those people get crunched by the majority of people who are actually moderate in outlook.
That's very, very encouraging to hear, and thank you, and from your lips to God's ears. I wanted to ask you about one of what I think is the most serious threats in terms of Israel and international affairs, and it's basically a threat of lawfare, and we're going to be dealing with that in greater depth next week when we have someone by the name of Andrew Tucker, who's an international lawyer who's based in the Hague. He'll be doing next week's Pile Poulet Plague, our next week's session. But Israel is currently facing the threat of lawfare from the International Court in The Hague, where the chief prosecutor seems hell-bent on charging Israel with war crimes. Now, given the ICC is an arm of the UN, from my perspective, it begins with a big black mark against it, from the beginning. Our guest next week, as I said, Andrew Tucker, will be dealing with this in greater depth. But his view is that basically the ICC has been something of a failure institutionally, and it's now seeking to justify its existence, and therefore the prosecution of Israel stems from an expedient desire to redeem its prestige after a series of humiliating failures. Now, President Trump has taken a Magnitsky-style action against the court, threatening individual court officials with sanctions on travel to the United States if the prosecution proceeds. So, no trips to Disney World with the kids. If the prosecution does proceed, it will establish a very dangerous precedent, in my view. For, as we've seen on the issue of terrorism, Israel serves as I guess you could say, a canary in the coal mine for the democratic world. So who's to say that what happens now to IDF soldiers may not happen at some future date to Aussie diggers? So what's your view of this what I would characterize as an ICC travesty? And do you think it might be time to consider an Australian withdrawal from the Rome Treaty, which is the treaty that established the ICC?
I think, look, I think that it's better to be in these organisations than out. I think that, for example, we use the Treaty of Rome for part of bringing, or for some of the prosecutions around some of the ISIS fighters. So I think it, what I do think, just I guess to go back to broad principles, is that in the international community, Israel, so I'm thinking really here of the Human Rights Council, is the only country with a particular article, essentially an agenda item that discusses Israel as a sort of human rights violator. Now, the fact of the matter is that the countries that are elected onto the Human Rights Council are some of the most recalcitrant countries in terms of human rights in the world. So I think some of the organisations of the international, the global organisations need to probably have a good, long, hard look at themselves. I think in terms of this particular action around war crimes and Palestine, well, I think it fails at the first hurdle because you would need to have a state doing the prosecution, and Palestine is not a state. I think, it's ALP policy that there be a two-state solution, and I think anyone who loves Israel wants peace and security in the region so that Israel can, I was going to say can prosper. It already has prospered, but so that its citizens can live in peace. And I think, I spoke about Israel in my first speech, and it's an amazing place. And what I said in my first speech is Israel is like life itself. I find it's such a vibrant, vital place. But I think in terms of some of the organisations, and I think the Human Rights Council is actually the most egregious example, I think that there needs to be some, I don't think that Israel should be its own agenda item for a start there. And in terms of this action, and in terms of, as you say, Ted, lawfare, I think that, Australia has, announced that we wouldn't cooperate with the ICC on this matter.
We submitted a friend of the court brief. basically
we did, and
challenging
superiority.
the very
Yeah.
essence of the prosecution.
Yes, that's right. And so I think that, I think this is sort of a bit of a try on. I think the way forward is to ensure that these sort of try-ons, because, I mean, we've just discussed some members of the Democrat, elected representatives of the Democratic Party in the United States. Often there's a push on the barriers, people try to push out as far as they can go, see what they can get. But of course, they leave behind where most sensible people are. And I think this is another example. Sometimes courts can be incredibly woke, but it's actually not justice.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think this is an example of that.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and that's my shtick. And I will, at this point, thank you, Kimberly. We'll hand over to David, who's going to preside, or sorry, to Alan, who'll preside over the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Now, well, we will go to David, and he can make a couple of comments before we get started.
Okay. Now, thank you, Kimberley, for participating in this event. I haven't had the long-standing relationship with Kimberley Kitching that Ted has, but I don't want to let her off the hook entirely with a couple of issues that are priorities for AJA. So, Kimberley, I'm going to ask you about two, because I think two is sufficient for tonight. You suggested that the Human Rights Council is the most egregious of the UN arms when it comes to Israel. Well, I'd suggest there's one that's worse, and that is UNRWA.
Yeah.
And the reason it's worse is because it is actually, through its education arms, and we have huge evidence of this, inciting and glorifying terrorism. It's essentially trained 2 generations of terrorists. Hamas has gained control of the teachers' union. Now, Australia is currently, of the aid that's given in the budget line called Palestinian Territories, which comprises $43 million. The largest single component of that is to UNRWA, 20 million roughly, and it's unconditional. At the last ALP conference, there was a motion to double it, and again, unconditional. Now, I want your thoughts on that and what you would think about, as some other countries are starting to do, either to suspend or to impose conditions on the aid, namely that it be, what we would regard as useful education rather than the, the terrorism components.
And and I have seen, the Palestinian media watch stories where schools are named after, suicide bombers, for example, and they're congratulated for killing, Israeli citizens. So I think that is terrible. UNRWA, I guess I didn't put them into I understand what you're saying, and obviously they're for the Palestinian territories. I think UNRWA is, I ask questions and estimates about this because UNRWA, of course, the CEO there was sacked for embezzling money and for having an affair with someone who worked for him. Maybe this was in 2018, I think. I think that, look, my personal view is that you can't have aid money being dispersed in a corrupt fashion. And that seemed to be, that was the United Nations Audit Office that made those findings. So obviously, if you are giving aid, you want it to go to the people who will benefit, and certainly in accordance with the goals of that organisation, the objectives. And if it's not going there, then I think you shouldn't give aid until you are sure that there isn't corruption in these organisations. And I will tell you, I've been to, some of the refugee camps in Jordan and in Lebanon. The refugees, the people made refugees by ISIS. So in the middle of the Jordanian desert, and some of the displaced persons camps in Lebanon. And there is a high level of corruption there as well. And they're all sorts of aid organisations. So, obviously people out of the goodness of their heart, or countries wanting to do the best that they can for someone, for people, where there've been terrible circumstances. But you have to make sure that that money is going to the right people. So, and I think we could be strong. I think Western countries could be stronger about this.
Yeah, it's got to go to the right people and for the right purpose. So
that's right.
We want kids to learn skills for life, not how to shoot and how to hate.
Absolutely. And in fact, when you see, in some of the areas where some of the settlements are, and the stories, you hear stories coming out of there where, a Palestinian boy is killed for playing because he's been playing with, Jewish children, and that's sort of seen as sort of a just punishment. And then the people who are glorified are the ones who are suicide bombers, including very young people. That is really heinous and actually immoral and wicked. And, one of the most terrible things I saw at a army base in Iraq was they had all of the captured sort of IED, so the suicide bomber vests, for example, and there was one there on a table, and I looked at it, and the Iraqi colonel saw me looking at it, and I said, it's so, and because I hadn't, you don't always, coming from Australia, you don't always automatically connect these things, but I said, is it sort of a belt or something? And he said, no. He said it's small because it was made for a child.
Right.
Now, imagine making something knowing that is going to be fitted onto a child's little body. And so the teaching of hate is something I think that is at the basis of all aid organisations in a way, and all, people who are trying to do good in the world. And that's what we have to keep in mind. And then,
Okay. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the suicide bomber and seeing a small suicide bombing thing. There's been a lot of work done on looking at the evidence, and I'm going to show now, only because you've raised it, a picture from a series of video interviews that was done on kids as they leave the UNRWA schools. And there was a young boy who actually said, right now I am prepared to be a suicide bomber coming out of the school. So, what you said is quite correct, and we have live examples of kids being interviewed saying that. Final point, before we throw it open to everyone, is unfortunately there's been, as I'm sure you're aware, Kimberley, across the world, and Australia's no exception, a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. No one has a magic bullet for that, but last year Australia became a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, along with 30-something other countries, about half of which have adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, but Australia hasn't. US has, UK has, a number of other countries. it's something we'd like to pursue later in the year. And I just wanted your thoughts and perhaps some guidance on how we should do that.
So I'm really in favour of this and of this definition, and this definition being adopted by the Labor Party, and saying that, you know, that yes, to have that definition as the definition of anti-Semitism. So the thought that people, you know, because people do say, oh, you know, it's nothing to do with Jewish people, but, you know, Israel, well, that is anti-Semitic. So, so I'm going to tell you the realpolitik of what I was going to do, which was to, in a motion, so move that we adopt the IHRC definition of anti-Semitism, but at the same time also move a motion about not tolerating Islamophobia, because that was a way of getting it through a state conference, firstly, so that there was a balance there, but we would have got the definition of anti-Semitism, which I think is the most complete definition that we've had. So, you know, that we've had. And but that was, I thought, a way of actually getting that through. I think I would have had, you know, there was, you know, the balance, and I think that all people, you know, of who are civilized are also not Islamophobic. It's another Abrahamic religion, and you know, I think, but that was a way of getting that definition through. Okay. So I'm very in favour of it, David, and I really hope that we can do that when we have, obviously, we just on Friday, actually the national executive of the ALP, we decided to defer the national conference in December, which was going to be in December in Canberra, partly because it just didn't look like we would be able to have a lot of people meeting because of the pandemic, because ALP conferences have not only all of the delegates, but thousands of people come. So, you know, there's sort of stalls and people doing, you know, talks outside and whatever. And it's a very sort of, you know, but we just didn't think that that was likely to happen in December, not yet. So maybe next year.
Thank you so much for that, and we'll provide any assistance we can.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that too.
Well, Alan, back to you, and if you'd like to open up for questions,
okay.
That'd be great.
Thanks, David. Now, just a reminder, people, if you want to ask a question, click on the participants icon down at the bottom of the screen, and then you can raise your hand or click the green tick. I can see a couple of hands up. Miriam will come to you in a moment, but while I've got the floor, Kimberley, I wanted to also not let you off the hook as such. A lot of us would see Labor as losing its strong affiliation with Israel and the Israeli cause. I want to ask you about the two-state solution, because that's something that we've seen. It's been around for in some form for over 100 years. It's been an abject failure. And we would say that it's not because Israel hasn't been trying, it's because the other side have really got no interest. They would much rather destroy Israel than build their own state. So, what, you know, as an ALP person, we see this drift away from strong support for Israel. So without, you know, I won't put you on the spot and ask you, you know, for you know, a formal policy. I mean, we hear what the ALP says. But what are some of your thoughts when you hear comments like that from someone in the Jewish community?
I mean, I think that some people who are, you know, advocating for, you know, the Palestinian state. So there are obviously some very strong supporters of a Palestinian state in the ALP. There's some, you know, the Friends of Palestine, but I think that in fact what they should probably focus on is strengthening some of the internal governance processes within the Palestinian, power structures. I mean, I'm very conscious that I think that Abbas is sort of 14 years into a 4-year parliamentary term. So, they don't have elections. And I think it's very hard to come to a two-state solution, as you say, if one side, there could be an agreement signed, but what are they actually representing? And are all of the people really behind that? Or, so it's very hard, because Israel obviously is a democracy. It has elections. It's had a lot of elections recently, but it's got someone who could sign a document and it would mean something. But I think the other side doesn't have that. So I think in order to move forward, I actually think the Palestinian part of this needs to actually be far more cohesive. And of course, what is happening in the Middle East is you've got, a whole lot of people who have other interests. The Palestinian cause is no longer the cause du jour. It's that people are more worried about Iran, or they're more worried about Syrian refugees, etc. So I think there's a lot less focus on the Palestinian cause than there once was, but I actually don't know whether that's helpful to enabling a Palestinian state, because
why doesn't anybody in the Labor Party say that publicly?
Probably because it's a very, it's a very complex. It's a complex. Not everyone reads the, would for a start. People have different policy focuses, if I can put it like that, and then I think you've also got some set views as well. But I think that when you look at it just in a common sense kind of way, isn't it? I mean, in order to make a deal, to have a contract, essentially, you need to have two parties that are able to form a contract.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of difficulty, and I think part of it is that, and one of the reasons why I really love Israel is that it never plays the victim. So, one of the things I did last December, I was in Israel, and I went to, the first time I've ever been to the Yitzhak Rabin Museum. But when you see, because obviously that's not just about his life, but also really a history of the state of Israel. And when you see how it developed and how they actually did something that every nation has to do, which is to be able to protect itself and maintain its borders, that's what Israel did. So it's never played the victim. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I think there'd be a lot of people around the world who might be happier if it did, but it's not a victim. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so special.
Okay.
I know I haven't really answered your question, Alan.
Okay.
I feel like I think people get very set in their ways and set in their views. And I think in order to move on from that, I think it's actually, that is probably what needs to happen.
Okay, so just before we go to the questions, I'm going to steal another minute. I'm sorry, but a lot of us would say that Labor support for Israel is waning because of voter demographics. How do you respond to that?
You mean demographics in Australia? Yeah.
I mean, if I need to spell it out, then clearly there's a large Islamic community which are going to be hostile to Israel. They tend to be typical Labor voters, and we just wonder whether Labor looks around the country and says, oh, there's more votes in that corner than there is in that corner, even though we might have some views, as you enunciated. It's ultimately to the benefit of Labor if we go in that direction, not that direction.
I think that it doesn't matter whether you're a politician or not. what is the principled view. And I think that I understand what you're saying, and there are probably particular areas of the country, but I think also that that doesn't excuse you. Sometimes I think in politics, people think by going down one path, that's what, where the numbers are, that's what achieves electoral success. When in fact, I actually think what is actually far more compelling for a voter is a party that is doing the right thing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Miriam, sorry to keep you waiting. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, well, it was following on actually what you were just saying now. Kimberley, I have seen you a lot on Sky. I note that you mentioned that you were doing work with James Paterson and Andrew Hastie from the Liberal Party, and then your passion for Israel, which is very obvious. If you view the fact that the Labor Party, that the number of Muslims in Australia is greater than the number of Jews and will continue to be much greater, and they traditionally would be voting for the Labor Party, do you think that you are in the wrong party, and couldn't you be more effective in the Liberal Party?
Well, I mean, look, I guess that I do get on, but I get on well with many people in the Parliament, and I think that's important to do. Do you know that I had an epiphany when I was on the Melbourne City Council, when I realised that there was a very lovely person who was a Green senator. His name was David Ristrom. And I thought, I just don't agree with you. There were so many things I didn't agree with him on. But I actually realised that I didn't mind that. I actually liked that he was engaged. So I never feel that, if someone has a different view from mine, that, that sort of attacking my very being. And I mean, some people do feel that. I think that I prefer people who are engaged in debate. So I think that, I work and I talk to a lot of people in my day, and I think that I'm hoping that one day that that I guess the moderate views I have within that are, become more, or I guess that I can have an effect on ALP policy, which I think I already have. I was a vice president of the ALP, but I think that my views on Israel. I think that you can, I got a very left-wing union secretary to go to Israel. And I organised some things for him to do, some people to meet and some things to see. And he is a full convert. So I think it's possible. And he didn't have that view. He didn't want to go. And I said, I'm telling you, you will love it. Tel Aviv is sort of like Byron Bay, but with more culture. And he loved it. And he met with the union secretary. Obviously, Israel has a very strong industrial relations, arm of in its polity, and I think he loved it. It was just not what he expected at all. And there've been other very left-wing people who've gone there and loved it. Yeah. So
very good.
It's an easy place to love, I think.
Yeah.
You think about those the reliefs that are on the side, near the water, near the beach in Tel Aviv, and it tells a story of immigration to Israel and boats coming. Well, there's a lot of people in the left of the ALP who have total sympathy and have run their careers on that. on essentially people seeking refuge.
Mm.
So, you know, Israel did that a long time ago.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kimberley. Ruthie, please unmute yourself. And we've got Leon, Saula, Beatrice, and Michael.
As a matter of fact, you asked all the questions I wanted to ask, but if I can, I don't know if Kimberley will be able to answer it because she's not in the government. Australia nominated about $5 million to give Lebanon. And for that matter, also to the Palestinian Authority, etc., etc. How can we assure that the money goes for the purpose it is intended for and not otherwise? What kind of regulation or stipulation can we put, and who can control it?
I think that's a very good question. I had the same thought myself about the aid money going to Lebanon. I actually don't know how is it being given to a particular authority in order for it to be dispersed, or how is it, you know, is it in essentially, you know, sometimes we give in kind, so we might send teams of people over to, I guess in this case it would be to clear streets, etc., to rebuild.
That's fine for estimates.
Yeah, it is. It is. So because you do, and that's why I always ask about UNRWA, by the way, at estimates, because I like to have the Department of Foreign Affairs, Defence, and the Foreign Affairs and Trade looking at, well, knowing that people are making sure that the appropriation is spent properly. I don't know, Ruth. I think that's a good question because obviously, you know, you don't want that to be, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that Lebanon has a level of corruption in its public sphere, and you would certainly want that money to go where we have either directed or for the aims that we have said we want the money to be used.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Leon, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, good evening, Senator Kitching. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Leon.
I'm sorry you can't see me. I don't have a camera. I can see you, however. Senator Kitching, why is it that the conflict between Israel, or actually I should phrase that more correctly, why is it that the Arab-Palestinian war against Israel seems to have become a permanent fixture at ALP conferences? How do the anti-Israel members of the Labor Party try to justify that it is in Australia's national interest to be anti-Israel? And what is so left-wing about supporting a society, or certainly the leadership of a society, whose publicly proclaimed values are so different from the values of mainstream Australia?
I think, Leon, that is a very good question. And I mean, one would have to wonder why we have a lot of discussion about the two-state solution, about anti-Semitism, you know, which motion, what does that mean, etc., when, you know, there's an incredible security threat to the Middle East in the form of Iran. And we don't really discuss that outside, really. Really, we don't discuss it at all, but obviously, you know, there is discussion sometimes about nuclear weapons and nuclear power. I certainly remember at the 2011 conference there was discussion about, you know, nuclear power or selling uranium to non-proliferation treaty members. And then we've also had a discussion about what was called the ICAN motion, which was about nuclear, not accepting any, for example, anything that was, any ships that were nuclear powered, et cetera, into our ports. I think that's a good question, but I think it's partly because, as I was saying before, you've got people who have very set views, and it's sort of everyone knows where they are in the debate. And so we have these debates every time and every conference. So I think that's what it's about, and people feel sort of comfortable about it, and it wouldn't be really a conference without having this debate. But I think the question about the International Holocaust Remembrance definition of anti-Semitism is important because it removes the ability of people to say that they're really only criticising a state and that is not anti-Semitic. So I think we should have that debate, and we should have that, that should, in my personal view, should form part of the platform. But we may end up having, I can see that there could be a more, people arriving at some sort of, moderated position, or, but you can't really do that with this definition, but people will try to do that. But, why don't we debate Iran?
Yeah, exactly. We're coming up to time, but with your permission, Kimberley, we've got a few more questions, just a couple.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
Saul or Beatrice, please unmute yourself.
Right, Saul Berstonsky here. Could I just ask you this? And as they say in Yiddish, jetzt reden wir Tachlis. Now we're talking business. When it comes to an election, and I have to work out what party to vote for, I have to think, if I were to vote for the ALP, I think, well, Albanese, yeah, what's he like on Israel? Plebiscite, if she becomes leader, well, in the past, but has she changed? Has she really changed? What about Burke? Oh, forget about Burke. But I don't have to think about those things when it comes to voting the other way for the opposition. So you've got a little problem there, have you not? Why would I vote for the ALP when I look at the possibility of its leadership?
Well, I think that, in fact, the leadership is really bound by the party platform. So that's why, we, in the platform, and certainly our foreign affairs spokesperson, Penny Wong, has very moderate views, has views that are very reasonable and very sensible on Israel. Certainly we have in our platform a two-state solution, and that is what binds the federal caucus. So the point is, I guess, is that if the conference makes that decision, and that's why it's so important that we don't really have that Corbyn element within the ALP, because they're all over in the Greens, thank goodness. But that conference is the one, and remember, it's not, you've got the large unions there, you've got, rank and file members there, and they are the ones voting on the platform. And that binds the leadership. It binds the caucus.
Okay. Michael, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. Hi, Kimberley. I think I was a bit taken aback by your comments about Penny Wong, but I won't get into that. I think
no, really, she's very, if I'm happy to send to Alan or to David or Ted the, various statements. I mean, that there are very moderate views in the ALP Federal Parliamentary Caucus.
Okay. Well, I wasn't going to speak about her, but what I wanted to say is we've been we've been very fortunate to have Michael Danby in the ALP. He's been a great supporter of the Jewish community and Israel, also strong against the Iran. I'm concerned that we don't have anybody like him anymore in the Labour Party. We've got Mark Dreyfus, but he's a non-event. He was against the Israel embassy move, and he's against stopping payments to Palestinian pay for slay. So is there anybody else in the Labor Party other than yourself, that names that we should be looking out for, that we know that are supporters of Israel?
I think, well, I mean, the new member for Melbourne Ports is now McNamara, Josh Burns. I think there's Daniel Molino, who is the new member for Fraser, which is in the West. He also has a PhD in economics from Yale. So he's, very moderate, in an economic sense, a finance sense.
Good.
And look, I fought to have, people like Daniel pre-selected, because it's really important to have, moderate people who, have very sound foreign policy views. I'll go back to basic principles. I don't think you've got any purpose being in federal parliament unless you are there to help guarantee the national prosperity and to guarantee national security. They are the two pillars of a federal government, and you must work to ensure those in order to be able to be seriously considered to be able to form government. So I think having, there's a lot of people in the Victorian right of the ALP, I would say, who are very moderate and very sound on Israel.
Tim Watts, he's good.
Yes, and Anthony Byrne, who's a deputy chair to Andrew Hastie on the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. So these, there are a lot of good people in the ALP.
Okay.
And I say, and I think that when we're able to meet again in person, it would be really good, I think, for you to meet some of it, to meet them, and they're very sound and real, real supporters of Israel. I'm very sorry that Mike Kelly resigned in New South Wales in Eden Monaro. He was a very, very real mensch, in fact.
Okay. Look, we'll take one more question. There are a couple of other hands up, but we've gone a little over time. So Anna, you've been waiting a while. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Not so much a question as a comment on which I'd like Kimberley's response. The whole Middle East, there are so many kleptocracies, and the head of UNRWA was fired, his property seized. A few years ago, one of the key workers of World Vision was fired for sending money to Hamas instead of to children. If the worst that happens to these people is they get fired, and the International Criminal Court is busy suing, charging Israel, what the hell is the role of the International Criminal Court?
Well, I don't think, they're there to hear, to adjudicate, but I think that they really should, reject this matter, at the first instance. But I think, to your broader point around, corruption, and to go back to where this conversation started, I would say that's why legislation like Magnitsky legislation, which puts a line in the sand to say, if you engage in human rights violations, if you are corrupt, we do not want you. We don't want you here. We don't want you coming on a diplomatic visa. We don't want you owning property in our jurisdiction. We do not, you know, we reject what you have done, the actions that you've committed. And that's why I think that kind of legislation is important. But I think, you know, there's obviously around the world, you know, a lot of people who take advantage of firstly their compatriots, but also of the goodwill and the desire to help that a lot of countries have. And I think that is, you know, we must be ever vigilant around that. And that's why, you know, there are, you know, it's important to ask the Department of Foreign Affairs what, you know, where this money goes, where does the aid money go, what is it spent on, to have full accountability of that. It's really very, very important.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Look, I think we'll have to wrap it up at this point. Kimberley, thank you so much. Look, we've put some tough questions to you. I actually like the fact that you're wrestling with some of these concepts because they're difficult issues. There's no easy answers, and one of the things we don't often, well, we don't like is just, you know, standard run-of-the-mill cliche type answers. So thank you for being so genuine.
You know what Andrew Bolt says to me sometimes after the panel that when I go on his program, he says, you're way too honest for your own good.
It's very refreshing, and it was very nice to see. I'll just hand back to David Adler to tell us what's coming up, and then we'll call it a night.
Thank you, Alan.
David? Where's David?
Here I am. I've got to unmute myself. That would help, wouldn't it? Okay. Just very briefly. Next week we have a session on anti-Israel lawfare with one of the great international law experts, Andrew Tucker, who heads a think tank in The Hague, who's done tremendous work on looking at Middle East issues and Israel in particular. We'll cover things like BDS, like sovereignty, like the RCC. So that's a world-class expert not to be missed. As usual, we call on everyone who attends our sessions to support AJA by looking at the material on the Facebook, joining the email list if you haven't done so. And if you're not yet a member or haven't made a contribution, please go to the website there. And finally, you'll see a new look start to emerge as we are starting to roll out our new logo on various things. It'll be a bit of a transition, but there it is. Ted oversaw the development of this logo through the engagement of a graphic designer, and we think it's pretty good anyway. Okay. Well,
thanks, David. Okay, well, thanks to you, David. Thanks to Ted. Thanks to Senator Kitching, and thanks to everybody that joined us. We look forward to having you back again next week. So until then, good night to you all. Good night.
good night.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Kim. It was great. Very good.
Thank you.
Okay.